a video Bible study, but it's a study. We do videos based on Men's Network, which is part of our Luke and Hour ministries. And these are studies that are geared particularly to men. And we're currently doing a study in the lost books of Bible books, or actually books that did not make it into the Bible. Ron always reminds me that his Bible was found. But invite all the gentlemen to come and join us on November 21st. It'll be a Thursday night at 6 o'clock. So we also have, if you're looking for a non-traditional service on Saturday nights at 5:30, something called Sabbath Break. So I'm just giving you kind of a rundown. I get a chance to have some other folks come visit us, and so I have to put a commercial in for Emmanuel Luther, and glad to have you with us. We're going to begin with an invocation. So we all please stand. Let us pray. Father God, we come together as a group seeking to gain better knowledge of our history and your role in the founding of our nation. Lord, without the divine hand of providence, this would not be the exceptional nation that it has been through all its 250 years of history. Lord, we once again wanted to be that exceptional nation, one nation under God. We wanted to be of righteous men and women of all denominations, all creeds, but giving allegiance to you. Lord, we studied in our Bible study today a time in Israel when Israel had no king, and what that meant, they had no God and no Lord. Lord, we face that similar situation in our country today. We have no king. We have no one to guide us. We want you, once again, Lord, to be our guide and to watch over this wonderful nation that you have created. You carved this nation out of all the nations of the world. And we ask that you be with us this day and the next hour or so as we gather and we study and we learn from the speakers that are gathered here. We thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to come together. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. And I hate to ask you to stand again, but if you'd join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Well, my name is Glenn Hagenbach. I'm one of the founders of Project Teach America. And just a brief word about us. We are an organization that was founded right here in the Valley, and our mission is to educate people on the founding principles of the country. We want to unite people on principle, not divide them on political talking points or partisan talking points. We are not and will not be affiliated with any political party, nor are we affiliated with any organized religious organization. As I said, our mission is one of education. The Faith and Liberty series, which you're attending tonight, is our first efforts in accomplishing our mission. And tonight, we're going to have an interesting presentation on social justice versus socialist justice and what that means. Our first speaker tonight is Pastor Ron Smith. He is a graduate of Moody Bible Institute. He was ordained to the ministry by the Fellowship of Independent Baptists in 1961. In addition to spending several years as a missionary in Mexico, Pastor Smith has also worked for several major corporations, as well as owning and managing several companies himself. In 2002, he started Church of the King in McAllen, where he's still serving as pastor today. And if that were not enough, and I know it sounds hard to believe based on the evidence in front of us, but at the age of 69, he received his doctorate of biblical studies. I mean, I had to fact check that one because, frankly, I didn't think the man looks that far down the trail, shall we say. Pastor Ron has graciously agreed to speak with us tonight, and he will be speaking on the origin and the meaning of social justice. Pastor Smith.
This is so the sound will go directly to that camera back there. I have a little tract that I wrote on social justice, and they're over there. Where are they, Juan? On that table?
No, front table here.
Front table. And they're free. And if you know of someone else you'd like to give a copy of, this is not the same as what I'm going to say tonight, but it expands on it a little bit more. Social justice. So feel free to take one of those with you. What is justice? That was the great question, and if you remember, if you've ever read Plato's Republic, and Plato asked that question, and there were several volunteers that he proved wrong by asking a series of questions for each one. Might is not right. That was the first one that was suggested. The strongest guy, whoever has got the biggest sword or the biggest gun, and Plato proved that was wrong. This picture of Lady Justice that you see up here, this is the personification of justice, balancing the scales. And this dates back to the goddess Ma'at in Egypt, and later Isis in ancient Egypt. So the idea of justice dates back to Adam and Eve. The human race from the beginning has always held these truths concerning justice to be self-evident. Around 2000 BC, Abraham asked God, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" And we hold these to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. You agree with that? That means the Creator endows every man with certain inalienable rights. That means those rights are not transferable, not transferable, or capable of being repudiated. They are inalienable rights. And what are these rights that God gives us? The God-given rights. Life, liberty, and property. What are the demands of justice? Justice demands that if anyone, including rulers, violates these rights by taking someone's life, liberty, or property, see the sword she has up there? The sword of justice demands equal justice. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Contrast that to a hand for a loaf of bread. The draconian so-called justice of Islam. And that quote I just gave is God's law in Exodus chapter 21. Jesus did not contradict that law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus gave the correct interpretation of the wrong interpretation of the traditions of the Jews, because that is justice, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And the prophet Micah said, "He has told you, O man, what is right." So we say that these truths are self-evident because God has told every man. He has told you, O man, what is right. So there's no right to demand the transfer of property from one to another by the government or by anyone else with a gun. These rights are inalienable and not transferable to another. There's no right to a free education. There's no right to demand anything free, because it would involve the violation of somebody else's rights. Right? All men are created equal, both rich and poor, small and great. But not all men are created equal in gifting. Therefore, all men are not equal in results. Jesus declared the self-evident axiom, for whosoever has, to him more will be given. And whoever does not have, even what he seems to have will be taken from him. The rebel against God says that's not fair. But that's the way it is, and you're not going to change it. But the state is always trying to change it. For governments to bring about equality in results is to play God. The state wants to be God. And to do that, they must violate justice by means of partiality. Partiality in judgment. They rob some in order to give to others. We're going to help you by taking from that guy and giving it to you. In the process, government takes its own cut. They get their commission. We leave quite a bit in Washington when we send taxes there before it comes back to the states. That involves the plunder of private property. Thou shalt not steal. This brings us to the Ten Commandments. Every one of the commandments involves private property, private prerogatives, including God's prerogatives. Here's a picture of the Ten Commandments. If we picture them in two columns, on the left you see the first five, and on the right you see the last five. The first five correspond to the last five. The first commandment is, you shall have no gods before me. If you go across to the second five, the first of the second five, which is number 6, do not murder. Why? Because man is made in the image of God. So to rob God of his prerogative by having another God corresponds to robbing man of his image, of the image of God in him. Thou shalt not murder. The second commandment, no idols, corresponds to the second commandment on the second 5. No adultery. And idolatry is always described as idolatry in the Bible. Idolatry is always described as adultery in the Bible. Number 3, third commandment is, don't take my name in vain. To steal God's name is to take it in vain. Or to take it in vain is to steal his name. That corresponds to the third commandment on the second table, thou shalt not steal. And then the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, corresponds to the fourth commandment on the second table. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Because the word Sabbath in the Hebrew is the same word as oath, or comes from the same root as the word for oath. So oath and Sabbath, Sabbath, is the same. The words oath and seven also is the same. 7 is the same one, so you really got 3 words there. Oath, 7, and Sabbath. They're spelled the same in Hebrew. So, to keep the Sabbath is to bear testimony. Thou shalt not bear false witness. See the correspondence? And the 5th commandment, honor your parents and inherit long life. This is talking about the future. It's talking about inheritance. And the 5th one on the second table, thou shalt not covet, also talks about inheritance. Thou shalt not covet a man's wife, a man's donkey, so on, so forth. Inheritance. In both of them. See how they correspond to each other? Oh, the wisdom of God. The Bible is just knit together like an intricate fabric because all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, wife, servant, ox, donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. And statism is all about coveting what belongs to somebody else. All 10 of these commandments are about private property rights and life and liberty. The 3 God-given rights. Some people believe there's no such thing as absolute law. They say all laws are just man-made. Well, if that's true, which law are we supposed to obey? The guy that's got the biggest sword? Is might right? If one man says he has a right to steal, and another says no, which law will prevail? Each man makes up his own. Will it not be the one with the biggest sword? With a series of questions, as I said before, Plato proved that was wrong. He's just using common sense. The Bible says the justice of God is what? It's revealed. It's revealed from heaven to all men. It's intuitive. It's self-evident. It says, what can be known about God? This is in Romans chapter 1. What can be known about God is plain to them, to all men. Because, it says, God has shown it to them. And then it tells why. For his invisible attributes have been clearly perceived. How? By the things made. So, it says, they are without excuse. Romans 1:19 through 20. Now, if that's true, then why do men not admit this about absolute law? The Bible says it's because they suppress the truth even though they know it's true in their hearts. For although they secretly knew God, I threw in the word secretly. Although they secretly knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Romans 1:21. Now, Romans chapter 2 then goes on to say that all men show the work of the law written in their hearts, even though they never heard of Moses, even before Moses. Paul's talking about all the Gentiles. He's talking about all mankind. He says they show the work of the law in their hearts, with their consciences bearing witness to that truth by either accusing themselves or excusing themselves. Either way, they're bearing witness to the fact that the work of the law is written in their hearts. Now, for believers, the law is written in their hearts, not just the work of the law. But for all mankind, the work of the law is written in their hearts. So they're without excuse. And we hold these truths to be self-evident. But men, since the fall of Adam, prefer autonomy. They prefer to invent their own laws to supersede God's laws. Auto means self. Nomos comes from the word for law. So autonomous means self-made law. Autonomous thought forces men to pick out some aspect of the creation as the origin of all meaning. And in doing so, the supposed autonomous thinker is made captive to a kind of idol of his own making. And that idol bends his understanding to conform to its dictates. So the autonomous man is tyrannically enslaved, forced, made captive to his own self-made idol. We are all slaves to what we believe in our hearts. So autonomous thinking is actually lawlessness. It's a violation of God's prerogatives that are clearly revealed to all men, self-evident and intuitive. The autonomous man thinks his thinking process is normal. He thinks his mind is the final court of appeal. He takes himself to be the reference point of all interpretation of the facts. And he has become a law unto himself, autonomous. God has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man that he has ordained, and he has given assurance to all men in that he has raised him from the dead. Now I want to introduce our next speaker, Pastor Jim Edge, my good friend and ally. Thank God for Jim. He holds a BS, Bachelor of Science in Material Science and Engineering from a Boilermaker, Purdue University. A Master's in Engineering Management from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and earned his Master in Theology from Concordia Seminary near St. Louis, Missouri. He's been the pastor of Emmanuel Lutheran Church for the past 9 years. In addition to his pastoral duties, Pastor Edge is actively involved in community economic development. He's also a lover and student of history. And last summer, he was a missionary in Kenya. He'll be speaking tonight on social justice versus social justice. Pastor Jim.
I want to tell you, it is humbling to be here tonight and speaking with such distinguished men as Glenn and Ron. I have a great deal of respect for Ron. Over the years, we've gotten to know each other through various meetings, and it's been just a real privilege. And I think the reason that I'm here is I made the mistake of standing up and talking at one of the other talks, and they said, "We'll call and order Pastor Jim to come and speak tonight." So it is my honor to be here speaking to you tonight, especially to represent and invite you all into our house here at Emmanuel. We're grateful to have you here with us and invite you back whenever the opportunity arises. One of my great passions as a pastor is that of educating youth. I mentioned that we have a school here, and I'm very proud of our children at Emmanuel Lutheran School. They go from pre-K to the 5th grade. And I tell my congregation often, I put up with all you old people because the icing on the cake is the opportunity to share faith, witness, and history with our children here at Emmanuel. And one of the things that I'm frightened about is the lack of understanding in this postmodern, post-Christian age for our children. And they're being duped, they're being robbed, not only, as you probably heard before we spoke, about the deficit and all of those things that are happening in Washington, but they're being robbed of the richness of their history and this thing called social justice. And I have a confirmation class of 5 youth, and they're really amazing youth. All but one of them come from kind of dysfunctional homes. 4 girls and 1 boy, and I think he's like a mad dog in a meat market because they're all beautiful. And I see him smile broadly when he comes into class. But they're there because they want to be. And that's one of the beautiful things. They've had the opportunity and seen things outside of the church, and they've made the decision to come, and they want to learn. And so I poke them a little bit, and we talk about various things. We talk about relationships. We talk about
of course, Scripture in our confirmation class, and we talk about the Ten Commandments. And in fact, we have this game that we do. I'll throw out a situation, and there's 3 types of sin. There's the sin of commission, omission, and missing the mark. And I'll give a situation. I say, which kind of sin is that, and which commandment did that break? And the kids are really getting good at it, and they're going to be meeting with the elders tomorrow night, so elders, be prepared. They may hit you up with some of those questions, so you got to be ready. But one of the things that appalled me, I asked them, I said, do you know who some people in history are? As we're going and we're talking about morality, and they really didn't have a good grounding. I said, do you know who George Washington is? They said, yeah, we know he's the father of the nation, right? First president. I said, good. Who's Alexander Hamilton? They went, no clue. How about Benjamin Franklin? Yeah, we've heard of him. I said, what's he known for? Couldn't really tell you. And these are high school and junior high kids. And then I asked about, do you know who Robert E. Lee is? And Alex, the one boy, says, oh yeah, I know, he was a World War I general. And I said, guys, we got a lot of work to do. But the beauty is they're willing to learn and they're willing to ask questions, and I'm grateful for that. But one of the things that, as we started talking about, they didn't understand what communism, what socialism was. And I said, what would happen if the government told you you couldn't come to this class? Would you come? And they stopped and they thought about that. I said, what if it was breaking the law to be here with me tonight in this class? And they thought back and they said, that's something to think about, Pastor. We've never had to face that before. I said, well, in some places it would be. In some countries of the world. And then we got a little bit further, and I said, now there's this thing called social justice, and that went way over their head. And I said, well, let me explain it to you. Social justice, and I use a biblical reference, one of my favorites, and I've heard Pastor Ron use this on his radio spots. King Solomon was faced with 2 women who came in, you know this story, both claiming the same little boy baby as their own, and arguing vehemently that Solomon should award the child to one woman or the other. And Solomon, in his wisdom, went and said to one of his soldiers, come bring your sword and we'll split this baby in half. And so each mother will get half of a baby. And they should be satisfied. And that's, as Ron said, that's equal justice. One gets half, one gets the other half. And yet the woman who really was the mother said, no, give it to the other mother. Give it to the other woman. She loved the child enough to sacrifice. And I said, this is what the world would ask. Are you willing to sacrifice for the good of others? And that's God's justice. That's not social justice. And then the other example that I have comes not from a theologian. In fact, he's an atheist. And most of my good Christian friends would say, Pastor, why do you even give this guy the time of day? It's Penn Jillette. He's a magician. He makes his living out in Las Vegas. Again, why do you want to listen to a guy out there? But Penn Jillette, even though he's an atheist, he's a libertarian, and he has an understanding of what's right and what's wrong. It's that inalienable law that's printed in the hearts of each and every one of us. It is something that God gives us. It can't be erased. And I watched him one time. He has a show. I won't use the full name for the show, but it's called BS, and you can fill in on cable. And it's for most Christians said, Pastor, why are you watching that show? That's terrible. But he had this show about social justice. And his partner, Teller, he's the little short guy who doesn't talk, but is kind of the butt of all the jokes and the acts that they do. And Penn and Teller both had this beautiful piece of coconut cream pie. Now, that got my attention because that's one of my favorite pies. And Penn starts eating his pie. He eats it very quickly, and Teller is just kind of picking at it, eating it slowly, like you should eat something that's really good. And Ken looks at Teller and he says, I don't have any pie anymore. You need to give me half of your pie. And so he goes and takes half of Teller's pie and starts eating it, and he gobbles it down, and Teller's still eating very slowly. Wait a minute, I have no pie again. You've got to give me half of your pie again. Now, it's a little bit like my grandfather who would come in and say, that looks like a good dessert. Let me taste it and see if it's good enough for you. But I explained to the kids, this is social justice. It's robbing. And just to kind of expand on Ron's thoughts, in Ten Commandments, social justice is theft, but it's also another word that we don't use much in our modern society. And I had to explain this one to the kids. The word coveting. Coveting is idolatry. It is desiring something that is not yours to make it yours. And that's, and with my kids, if I said maidservant, manservant, ox, and donkey, the kids go, yeah, whatever. I said, okay, let's make it serious. It's your Xbox. No, wait a minute, Pastor, you're getting serious here. It's your iPhone, your iPad. No, we can't share that. But if I have one and you don't, and you want it, it becomes an idol, and it becomes an obsession. And the whole basis for socialist justice is coveting, which is clearly a sin from Scripture. And so as I presented that to the kids and trying to make it clear in this postmodern relativistic era in which we live in that there are rights and wrongs. And then driving back, I was at a pastor's conference this past week in San Antonio, and I had the privilege once again of listening to a theologian by the name of Leonard Sweet. If you don't know him, that's okay, but I encourage you to look him up. He's a really interesting fellow. I don't agree with everything he says, and he says that's okay. I'm from the Methodist tribe, you're from the Lutheran tribe, but there's a lot of things we can share in common, and one of them is our belief in Jesus Christ. And I said, okay, amen to that. But he used a word, a conflagration of words, called, he took narrative and metaphor, and he calls it a narraphor. He says, now this is how we're going to explain things in the 21st postmodern era, and where you take a metaphor and a narrative and you mash them together and you present an idea. And so that's what I'm going to do tonight. And I'm going to use baseball. I love baseball. I was never any good at baseball. I'm much better as a fan than I ever was as a player. Part of it is I don't see with both eyes at the same time, but that's a whole other thing. I have no depth perception, which made learning to drive really interesting, but that's another story too. But I want to start off with some scripture. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up. First and foremost, we need to humble ourselves before our God and our King. And then where the equality comes in, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We are all equal before the throne of God as sinners. Now, as I told my congregation today, you also have the benefit, if you have faith in God, you're also a saint. So you're a sinner and saint by the grace of God. All right, well, let's look at a baseball field. Most of us are familiar. There's 9 players in the outfield. There's 90 feet between the bases. Each batter has 3 strikes or 4 balls. The pitcher's mound on a professional field is 60 feet away from home plate. And home run is a fixed distance out in the outfield depending on the field you're playing in. But it's the same for both teams. Equality before God. Equality, we're all created equal when we come to a regulation baseball field. So that's my metaphor. Okay? And here's the technical part. We've got the outfield grass, the grass line, the infield, which is usually dirt, the pitcher's mound. We've got right and left-handed batters boxes, and the double on-deck circle, the coach's box. All those things we know that makes, don't go too fast, that make a baseball field what it is. Okay, now you can go. And what makes us equal on baseball? There's 9 players per side. with special skills developed through competition. Ooh, that's a really bad word, by the way, competition. Through years of training. You mean you can't just walk out and be a great baseball player? No, you have to train your body, your mind, because there's eye-hand coordination. One of the most unnatural things in the world is to hit a baseball. I'm proof of it. I couldn't see that ball coming at me no matter what. I did share something in common with one of the Boston Red Sox. I was good at getting hit by the ball. Anything to get on base. Strategy is based on experienced managers who grew up in the game. And we admire the strategists. I admire Ron Washington. I think he's a great motivator of talent for the Texas Rangers. And the special skills of throwing and catching and amazing foot speed are required of all the players. Now, if you saw any of the great plays during the World Series, weren't they amazing? Diving for the ball, making catches, and getting up and making throws that makes the game exciting. And then knowledge based on studying your opponents. Know who your opponent is. Know what their weaknesses, what their strengths are, and play the game strategically. These are all good things in the game of baseball. Okay, next slide. And this happens to be Wrigley Field. I never went to a game there, but I used to have a customer who was just outside of Wrigley Field, so I got to be in the shadow of Wrigley Field. But it's a great place. It's a great temple to baseball. Tradition, the simplicity of the game, because it is a very simple game. Hit the ball, when it's thrown to you, catch the ball, throw the guy out, run to the base. Simple game, but with complex strategies, complex skills involved. Next slide. And one of the things that makes baseball good is the rules are kept by guardians of the rules, the umpires. They're to be fair and impartial for both sides. That's a great thing. They're like the Lady Justice. They don't see one side versus the other. At least we hope not. But they go back. Kill the ump. But things like the infield fly rule, the balk. Now that's a really hard one to understand. I think I'm finally understanding the balk. Foul poles, the strike zone, and the double play. All of those rules, all those things that make baseball really fascinating. They are the guardians of those rules, and those rules make sure that both teams have equal access to the game. Next slide. And the other thing, I am a romantic. I believe in heroes. Now, baseball heroes. I was fortunate enough growing up as a kid to be in San Francisco when Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Ron Marichal, and Bobby Bonds were all playing on the San Francisco Giants, and they were heroes. These were men of integrity, and you loved watching them play the game. And they encouraged kids. Johnny Bench was another player that I got to see play in those days. And Roberto Clemente, we know of Roberto Clemente, he died way too soon, but what he was doing after the season, he was going to help people in his country. He was sacrificing himself, his own fortune, to make life better for others. And then Cal Ripken Jr., what a gentleman he is of the game. These are heroes, and I love heroes. In history, Sir Thomas More is one of my great heroes. Thomas Becket is a great hero. And I have to say Martin Luther is a great hero of mine. They were willing to sacrifice, put their life on the line. I mentioned earlier Robert E. Lee. He is also a hero of mine. Yeah, he was on the losing side of the Civil War, but he was ultimately a man of integrity, and I respected him for that. My parents made me read Profiles in Courage when I was a little boy. And I fussed about it at first, and then I got into it, and I found true heroes that President Kennedy wrote about. Heroes are part of the game, and they're people that we can look up to and we can admire. And in this generation, this postmodern generation, our kids need real heroes, not the folk heroes or the false heroes, the Kardashians and all of those kinds of people of that ilk. It makes me sick when I see them. And I see the corruption of even good kids. I'm a little worried about Disney right now. It seems like if you want to get a kid ruined, let them be on a Disney show. And that's a sure sign they're going to be a train wreck. Next slide. Baseball is America's game played by American players, American kids. And it doesn't matter who you are, Hispanic, Asian, white, black, you can play this game and you can know this game. And it is truly our game. And I love the way that it's being picked up all around the world. Because of the uniqueness of this game, it's seen as a fair game, it's seen as a good game. But like all good things, it can be screwed up. And that's the thing that irks me. I have grandchildren now, and grandchildren give you a whole new perspective on life. And I'm very protective of my grandchildren. My wife says they're the most wonderful children in all the world, and I tend to agree. They're very bright, and they're quite card artists too. But I think most of us that are grandparents know that. So let's look at how social justice would affect baseball. Baseball with equal outcomes regardless. Okay, first thing. The distances between the bases are adjusted to the skill of the player. Players that are bigger and faster have a longer distance to run. Players who are overweight or slow-moving speeds have a distance reduced to make it fair. And then, I'm an engineer, so I'm sure that we could reduce this to a formula. The base distance is a function of the mean strength of the batter and the speed of the runner. Have you ever read environmental regulations? I had some years ago when I was an engineer in Chattanooga, and they had regulations of low melting. I made stainless steel pipe, and if you don't know what that's for, that's okay. It goes into high temperature heat converters for the utilities. And we were getting gigged by the EPA for lead, tin, copper, and zinc. And if you're not a metallurgist, that's okay. But what those things do in a high temperature application is called hot short. It fails the pipe. And it'd be the last thing in the world that I wanted in my stainless steel pipe that's going to be used for high pressure steam generators. Well, they had a formula for the number of pounds of metal that we produced, and that formula made it impossible for us to meet the standards for the flow of water going out into our settling ponds and into the sewer. And I was very concerned about that. And because I was a metallurgist, the plant manager said, "I think you know something about chemistry." I went, "Yeah." "Okay, you're now our environmental engineer." I said, "Oh boy." "You can spell environmental." I said, "Are you sure?" And so we're about to be fined very heavily by the local EPA. And I took samples and had them tested, and yes, the pollutant levels were according to the calculations in violation. And I did something I remember my high school chemistry teacher, you need a control substance or control sample, so I took tap water out of the same pipe that was used in our cooling water, and I ran that test. And lo and behold, I found out that our tap water was actually worse in terms of the pollutants, because we had something called diatomaceous earth, which actually settled out a lot of the ionic metals in the water. And I took the results and I showed them to our EPA guy, and I said, there is no way in the world that we can meet your criteria given that our tap water is already in violation. I was told I was a smart aleck, which I am. Since outs are negative, and this is social justice, we're going to outlaw outs, because outs affect the esteem of the player. We can't have everybody feeling good if they make it out. I can remember playing baseball, and if I struck out, I had tears in my eyes. The fact that I couldn't see the ball didn't matter, but I didn't like striking out. That's why I'd lean into the pitch and get hit. At least I could get on base. And all players will bat during the inning. Now we do that with tiny T-ball, but that's an instructional league. That's totally different. And the pitchers are restricted on the speed of their fastballs. None of this pitching close to 100 miles an hour. The average speed will be that a marginal player can hit. And the home run fence is eliminated because that's just unfair, because it favors those hitters who are very powerful, and we're going to move it in for the marginal players so they can get home runs, but the guys that can hit home runs consistently, they don't need that. They're already rich with home runs. And so we're going to work towards the marginal ability of the players. Go to the next slide. And something else we've got to do. In this social justice, we've got to change the baseball. That baseball is hard. You ever been hit by it? I got hit a lot. But so we're going to change it to a socially accepted, a new government baseball. It's a wiffle ball. That looks kind of like it. We'll put the stitching on it. And it'll minimize injury and ensure fair play among all. And by the way, we're not going to call them players anymore. We're calling them clients. Okay? Because that's a nondescript name for those that are playing the game. So for the clients of the game, they're going to get to play with this new government-approved wiffle ball.
Let's call them sissies.
That's discriminatory, Ron. Might be bigoted and
Politically incorrect.
politically incorrect. Yeah, next slide. And let's face it, the baseball bat has got to go. That is a weapon, and it uses wood, and it's going to endanger our forests that are falling by the wayside. We cannot have a wooden bat anymore, and it imitates war. I mean, you could take a baseball bat and you could hit a person. So we're going to do away with the bat. We've already done away with the baseball as we know it. And we're going to replace it with a new launching apparatus called the net. The net's not threatening. The net is soft. And if you can hurl the ball out of the net, you're doing good. But it's fair. It might get caught up in the net, but that's okay. You're not going to get out anyway. Next slide. Now we've got to do something about the names of teams. We've already heard this, and I really applaud the owner of the Redskins for remaining resolute. But we have things like the Diamondbacks. That's a dangerous snake. We have the Athletics. Well, that means they're probably better athletes than somebody else. Cardinals. Well, they're picking on the bird. The Manta Rays. Now, you notice they did change it. They used to be the Devil Rays, and now they're just the Rays. And you have other teams. You know, the Bears. The Bear's a predator. Or Cubs. That's a baby bear. So why are you picking on predators? And we don't want to emulate that. Astros, well, that implies somebody who has more learning, because an astronaut. And that would make somebody who doesn't have a college education feel inferior. So what we're going to do is we're going to trade in all those names and eliminate them because they contribute to the thoughts of superiority and inferiority in our cities. They imply racial inequities, you know, like talking about the Braves. We don't want to pick on them. And violent animals. We can't have that. So we're going to change our team logos to things like peace. And you can't get really upset about any of those. I mean, you've got the peace symbol. You've got hands held up at the dove. And then that one in the far right, I don't know what it is, but it's pretty. And you have the gay flag, because we've got to represent and recognize racial and sexual diversity. And Che Guevara, I mean, híjole, eres un héroe de la revolución, for those that understand Spanish. And Mao Zedong, I mean, he was a great man. He had to be. I mean, he ruled China for a long time. So, and trees and Greenpeace and the polar bear. We've got to remember the polar bears are dying. Not really, but and the world, you can't really see it that well, but the world's on fire because of global warming. And we've got to promote Earth Day. How would you like to be the Earth Day team? And then all the colors of the rainbow will be the rainbow baseball team. As I said, I'm a bit sarcastic. Go to the next slide. I started thinking about what the game of baseball would be like if social justice was involved. And again, one of my favorite movies is War Games. You remember that movie? The supercomputer Whopper engages with Matthew Broderick because he's just he's a geek, he wants to play some really cool war game or computer games back in the days of DOS when the computer screens were all green. The movie really dates itself now. And he inadvertently starts the road down to a global nuclear war. And the only way that Wappler is going to learn that nuclear war is bad is he's going to find out by playing tic-tac-toe that the game is pointless. Both sides lose. Now, in this social justice baseball, why do you want to play if we're going to play to a draw? That's about as exciting as watching grass grow. Now, granted, when it grows in the valley, we're excited. We get a little rain, that's a wonderful thing. But in real terms, are you going to pay money to go sit in the stands in the hot and watch a mediocre travesty of what is a great game? That's what we're being asked to do when we subscribe to social justice. We're being asked to compromise. Compromise on what we know is common sense. And I've said for years, common sense is the least common virtue, I think, in our society today. But it comes back to, are you going to obey God or are you going to obey man? The last story I want to share with you. I love scenes and situations of conflict between the social do-gooders. I think it's been maybe 7, 8, maybe 9 years ago. There's a group on the left that really enjoys promoting Indian culture, and I'm talking about Native American Indians. And the American Indians, I think it was out in Washington, had secured a permit because they used to go whale hunting. And they said, if we can go out and we can kill a whale. Now, I'm not opposed to hunting, but if we can go out and kill a whale, we will be American Indians. Hoorah! But then there were the environmentalists that said, oh, you're killing an animal. You're taking a life. Who wins in social justice? And the Indians eventually did get to kill their whale, and I think it was kind of pointless afterwards. They didn't really know what to do with the killed whale. They may have eaten it and then found out it really wasn't that good. It's kind of like I had a beagle a few years ago. Shiloh was able to kill a baby possum, and he growled at me. He thought I was going to take it away, and then he started eating. He goes, this thing's terrible. So is the taste of socialist justice in our mouths. Once we see what's really there, once we see what's being taken away, we find that it's just not palatable. And that's what we're being told from Washington and from the media, that we should just like it, no matter how bad it tastes. If we're true to our children and our grandchildren, we will teach them the truth. There is one divine truth. I'm not bashful about it. If you call me a bigot because I say there is one God and there's one truth, I'll take and wear that label proudly, because I am tied to the one true God, the God of creation. Yes. Now, I have some people that call me a secular progressive, and anybody that knows me laughs, because I'm not that. I've had some say I don't tell the truth, and if they know me, they know that's not true either. But this is something that I'm passionate about. And for us, we need to be passionate too, because this is our nation, this is our future, and this is our present. So I thank you for listening to me, and I hope I didn't offend you too much by changing the game of baseball. But I think it's well worth our time to take a look at and to analyze and see what those around us would do and rob us of. Our next speaker is a gentleman that I've come to know over the last couple of years, Glenn Hagenbach. In addition to being one of the founders of Project Teach America, Glenn holds a BA degree in finance from the University of South Florida, an MBA from Thunderbird School of Global Management. He's worked in corporate headquarters functions for Cisco Foods, Pepsi-Cola International, Frito-Lay, as well as serving in various civic and industry associations. So I invite Glenn to come up and to share his vision with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Pastor. And I was a little remiss earlier by not expressing how much we appreciate you opening your doors to us tonight and hosting this event. We greatly appreciate it. How many of you have watched this fiasco that was going on in Washington about the government shutdown and the ongoing battle of health care and everything? It's certainly confusing. It brings to mind what the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times. Okay, well, that is considered a curse by the Chinese. And the times definitely are getting rather interesting. And the reason for that is because we are mixing socialist justice with the general welfare. And that, my friends, is a formula for a major disaster. And I'm going to put this kind of as the healthcare debate as the background. Going back when the debate first started in 2009, there was a televised debate about the healthcare issue, about Obamacare. And a voter asked one of our congressmen a very simple question. Where does the federal government get the authority to do healthcare? And the congressman said, well, from the same place they get the authority to do Social Security and Medicare. Well, he's referring to the General Welfare Clause of the U.S. Constitution. But is that true? What is the general welfare? Where did it come from? And what does it really mean? The term, the general welfare, first comes into American political language from the Articles of Confederation. This was the first governing document of the country from 1781 to 1789. It was written during the midst of the Revolutionary War. And in Article 3, it mentions that the states enter into a league of friendship for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and the mutual and general welfare. This was an agreement amongst the states. It created intentionally an extraordinarily weak central government. The government had no money, no ability to raise money, it had no authority over the states, and it certainly had no authority over the citizens within those states. This was an extraordinarily weak government. It had unbalanced representation, and it was so weak that it could not function. In other words, it was inoperative. I want you to remember that word. This is why we had to write a new Constitution, which takes us to our friend Madison, the architect of the Constitution. There are certain mechanics, there are certain principles that are embodied in the Constitution. One is the separation of powers. It also addressed the problem of the representation both for the states and for the people. It has a system of checks and balances on power. The powers of the federal government are limited and are listed, they're enumerated. And it guarantees, in Article 4, Section 4, it guarantees a Republican form of government to each of the states in the country. If there is anything I want you to take away from tonight, it is that we are a republic. We are not a democracy. The Founding Fathers believed that democracy was the worst form of government. They were as violent as they were short-lived. A democracy is the whim of the majority. It is not the best of its wisdom. It is a majority unrestrained by law. Another thing that Madison believed in was writing things so the average person could understand it. If you look at that quote there, he says, "It will be of little avail to the people if the laws are so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent they cannot be understood." If only Madison were listened to today. But we have a problem when we turn to the Constitution. In the preamble, which is inoperative, it says that we formed this government, this Constitution, to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and something else very important, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. They were not thinking just about themselves. Everything George Washington did, he was thinking 100 years out. How would this policy affect the next century for the country? The problem is when we get into the powers of Congress, which are in Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 1, the first power of Congress is the taxing authority. Paragraph 1 says that Congress has the ability to lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all taxes shall be uniform throughout the states. All right. Which is it? Is it and or promote? Do we provide or do we promote? That's a very good question. And we're not the first ones to ask it. There was a man named Andrew Stevenson in 1930, had the same question. He was the 15th Speaker of the House. The issue before the House was a member, a long-time public servant, had died. His destitute widow needed money, and they wanted to give money from the federal treasury to this widow. It was argued that this was not a power of Congress. So Stevenson writes to Madison. He had very good reason. Madison, after all, was the architect of the Constitution. He was the 4th President of the United States, and he happens to be his wife's cousin. So he wrote to a family member and asked him this question about the General Welfare Clause. Now it's interesting. Madison here is 79 years old. He is going to answer Stevenson from his notes, which are 43 years old. And Madison gave to Stevenson, which in his own words was a tedious explanation of the origin and the meaning of the General Welfare Clause. He literally gave him a play-by-play explanation throughout the Constitutional Convention. And he explained that this phrase did not appear in the original draft of the Constitution. It was lifted out of the Articles of Confederation as a, quote, familiar though inoperative reference to Revolutionary War debt. And he admits the delegates did not pay much attention to the wording because of its identity with the harmless character attached to the instrument from which it was borrowed. In other words, this was an inoperative clause in an inoperative instrument. An instrument that did not give the federal government any power to reach the lives of the citizens within the states. It was totally inoperative. He also went on to explain that to develop the 18 enumerated powers of Congress, 137 amendments were offered and debated. Some a little more fervently than others. These were passionate men. They thought about this a long time. They worked very hard to list these 18 powers of Congress. Madison went on to explain that the delegates saw danger in every aspect of federal power. He stated in his letter that it, quote, exceeds the possibility of belief that delegates would have silently permitted the introduction of a phrase that would have rendered all the other restrictions and definitions fruitless. He referred to making the a general welfare clause an operative power, he stated that it would make the phrase pregnant with danger. He also said it was impossible that the delegates would have ever recommended a constitution containing this power to the states. And Madison was not just speaking from his notes, he was speaking from personal experience. At age 41, some 38 years earlier, there was a much more major issue before the Congress. The cod fishing industry was in trouble. This was a major industry in the Northeast. It affected a lot of states. And a bill was introduced in Congress to subsidize this industry. And Madison objected. And he warned that if Congress can employ money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of what that welfare is, then Congress may take into their own hands the care of religion. They may actually start telling religion what they can and cannot do. They may take the education of children into their own hands. They may appoint teachers in every state and pay for it from the Treasury. They may take into their hands the provision for the poor and the regulation of all roads, not just the post roads restricted by Congress. Was Madison opposed to providing provisions for the poor? Was he opposed to education? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But these were not the job of the federal government. This is what we had state governments for. This is what we had local governments for and local communities. This was not what the federal government was set up to do. He also went on to warn that, in short, everything from the highest object of state legislation down to the most minute object would be thrown under the power of Congress. It would subvert the very foundations and transmute the very nature of the limited government established by the American people. I like to look up words just to be sure. Transmute means to fundamentally change. To make the General Welfare Clause operative is to fundamentally change America. But Madison wasn't the only one who warned. In 1798, Jefferson said, to take a single step beyond the boundaries specifically drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession by the federal government of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible to any definition. In 1798, Jefferson said, our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single government. Public servants at such a distance and from under the eyes of their constituents will invite public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. I don't think our country has gotten any smaller, any less diverse, or any less complicated than it has since 1798. Now, one of the things that we heard during this whole fuss about the health care law was, it's the law of the land. It's the law of the land. Just accept it and move on. Well, if that's the case, under the Articles of Confederation and under the United States Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, the General Welfare Clause was not a power of Congress. That was the law of the land for 156 years. It is not a power of Congress. So what happened? How did this change? Well, history's like scripture. It's best served up in context. And we have to realize that from about 1850 to 1920s, the United States and the world went through enormous change. We had the Industrial Revolution come into its full flower. We had an explosion of innovation and production. We had rapid and drastic demographic changes, immigration to the United States, movement from cities to the cities from the country, the shift of farm work to factory work. and there were social abuses. Now, I want to put some of this in context to you. I have a copy of a letter from the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. It was written to Nikolai Tesla on his 75th birthday. And it said, "It must be with no little pride and gratification that you realize how much the inventions which you had made prior to 1890, culminating in the numerous patents issued to you, covering generators, motors, transformers, transmission systems, etc., known to the art as alternating current, have done to advance the welfare of your fellow man. It was your work which made possible at so early a date the successful development at Niagara, the first commercially viable hydroelectric plant in the world. The pioneer in the adoption of your systems on a large scale and the forerunner of the tremendous electrical power industry which has grown up throughout the civilized world and without which modern life as we know it would be impossible. With heartiest congratulations and best wishes." Prior to 1897, digress a little bit, the 1850s to 1900s, this was the age of Vanderbilt. This was the age of Andrew Carnegie Steel. This was the age of Rockefeller, who became the wealthiest man in the world because he developed the Standard Oil Company. The Standard Oil Company produced kerosene for lamps. Prior to the Niagara hydroelectric plant, the world, in all of human history, the world had been lit by fire. Talk about change. Everything we know in our modern society today would be impossible without what happened during this very brief time in American history. But along with great changes came great social abuses. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, and literally on the other side of the mountain from where I grew up is where the labor movement started in the United States, because the coal mines were actually practicing human slavery, economic slavery. You went to work for the coal mine. If you ever wanted to leave, all you had to do was pay your bill, because they ran a tab for you and always made sure your salary wasn't enough. You never had enough money to pay your tab and leave. You were a slave to the coal mine. If any of you know Tennessee Ernie Ford's 16 tons, tell St. Peter that I can't go, I owe my soul to the company store. This is what they're talking about. It was capitalism without a moral compass. Any economic system, any political system without a moral compass is denigrating and destructive to humans. So, along with these great changes came new ideologies in response to them. This was the age when we had Darwinism that challenged how we viewed God and his creation. Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto. It was first translated in English in 1850. This was later refined and made operative during the Russian Revolution 1917 with Vladimir Lenin, and we developed the Marxist-Leninist ideology. The socialism actually has several different meanings, but the one I'm focusing on tonight is Marxist-Leninist socialism. And it's in pink, because some people don't remember that people who were kind of communist sympathizers were called pinkos. They weren't quite totally red yet, okay? Under Marxist-Leninist ideology, socialism is a transitional step from capitalism to communism. It is just a phase. Okay? You must realize that Marxist-Leninism is a utopian ideal. And all utopian ideals end in tragedy. It is also an atheist ideology, which puts it with no moral compass. And under that ideology, the state is supreme. They do not believe in the traditional family. They don't believe in private property. To them, equality means sameness. in all things. Socialism is one of their tools. It is an aggressive ideology. It seeks global domination, and it is parasitic in its nature. Also along these lines, we had the rise of the eugenics movement. These are people, kind of friends of Darwin, who thought that they could improve the human gene pool by eliminating undesirable aspects of it. It was the writings of the eugenics movement that inspired Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime for their final solution and how they could create a master race. One of the leaders of the eugenics movement was a young lady named Margaret Sanger. She, in 1941, changed the name of her pro-abortion organization to Planned Parenthood. And last year, our government gave them $500 million, somehow justifying it under general welfare. Probably the least dangerous of the group there is the progressives. The progressive ideology wanted to use science and apply it to for the betterment of man. They saw the government as an agent of human welfare. Okay, so you can kind of see why they might be a little sympathetic to the Marxist model. With the turn of the last century, we had our first progressive president. And actually one of my favorite, Teddy Roosevelt. And I don't know if you can read the quote there, I'll read it for you. Teddy said, "If you could kick the person in the pants most responsible for your trouble, you wouldn't sit down for a month." You gotta love this guy. He was the first president to drive a car. He was the first to use a telephone, the first to fly in an airplane. He was the first to travel abroad while being in the presidency. He was the first president to invite a black man to the White House for dinner, and almost reignited the Civil War all over again. He invited Booker T. Washington to dinner. Teddy instituted reforms, antitrust laws. He broke up monopolies, which, by the way, he broke up Standard Oil. And when he broke it up, Rockefeller ended up with large ownership in the other companies that were created, which became Exxon and Mobil and a whole bunch of other. Actually, Rockefeller became richer after the breakup of his monopoly, which just goes to show that monopoly is not a good thing. That competition is actually a good thing. Teddy Roosevelt intervened on the side of the miners to break a coal strike in 1902 that was threatening the security of the country. He supported the first federal law for inspecting of food and drugs. He created national parks. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize for, of all things, actually negotiating a peace treaty between the Russians and the Japanese in 1907. He was an extraordinary guy. Okay? Then another generation came, and we got our second progressive president, Woodrow Wilson. This is where things start to change. Even though it was started before his term in office, under Woodrow Wilson, the 16th Amendment was passed, giving us the IRS and the progressive income tax. Now, the income tax does not have a scriptural basis, the progressive income tax. It's not found in the Bible. It is found in chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, right after they get done describing how they need to destroy the traditional family to make the state supreme, how they need to destroy private property, destroy religion, make everybody dependent on the state, and the progressive income tax is one of the primary tools for accomplishing that. Also under Woodrow Wilson, we had a crisis. The World War I of 1914 to 1918. And during that crisis, we started seeing all these war posters coming up, wrapping patriotism and the need for defense and everything around something that Wilson is most famous for saying. We need to make the world safe for democracy. We hear this today. In Egypt, we have to have the Egyptians make room for democracy. Let me ask you something. We're a republic. Our founders thought democracy is the worst form of government in the world. Why in the world would we want to make the world safe for democracy when it's a horrendous form of government? Why aren't we making it safe for republicanism? Of course, during his presidency and during the end of the First World War, we had the Communist Revolution in Russia and the rise of the Soviet Union, and Marxist-Leninism put into action. Now, the progressives I'm sorry, I'm missing a section, but that's all right, I'll use this. The progressives viewed government, as I said, as an agent of human welfare. The U.S. progressive movement was actually very interested in what was happening in the Soviet Union in the 1917, 1918 revolution. I mean, this was a very interesting idea. These people had thrown off a king. They were talking about equality for man. And this was, very attractive and very appealing to a lot of the academics and progressive intellectuals in this country. And in 1924, a group of intellectuals and academics and other people involved with economics and things like that took a trip to the Soviet Union. And they got Stalin's dog and pony show. The Soviet experiment was failing. Stalin needed money from the West, so he showed them what they wanted to see. He did not show them the realities of what was actually happening in the Soviet Union. Prior to World War II, Stalin starved millions of Ukrainians so he could export wheat to earn money for his government. And one of those weird things where you wonder if God is warning us. Those groups, that group sailed to Russia on a vessel known as the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the first progressive president. They returned on a ship called the Leviathan, the monster. They left the progressive, came back with a monster. If you had to make a point where Leninism and the U.S. progressive movement started to infiltrate, this is it. Okay? Of course, it didn't happen in one trip, but it was a process where these two ideologies started to come together. Now, the boom of the 1920s and slowed the growth of the progressive movement and the influence of this ideology. This is a foreign, alien ideology. It slowed it until another crisis. And that was the market crash of 1929, starting the Great Depression, which brought us FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the New Deal. Well, by the time Roosevelt became president, millions of Americans were out of work, and they were desperate. He offered them hope for a brighter future. He offered them a New Deal and said things were going to change. But let's get our thinking straight here. This is a crisis, so we're going to have to do some different things. We're going to have to pay unemployment benefits and provide pensions. Why, we're going to have to develop new sources of electricity, and we're going to have to build roads and bridges and parks. So, how do we make a New Deal? Well, first thing, let's trade in that old model. You can obviously see that the old Constitution is just too slow and out of date. It's outdated. It can't put up and can't handle these times. FDR offered a slick new model called federal control. Next thing, he quickly passed legislation. Of course, it helped he had majorities in both houses. FDR ran through Congress a series of poorly crafted bills. Some of them were pushed through so quickly they were not even printed in time for the floor vote in Congress. They literally had to pass the bills to know what was in them. I'm glad that doesn't happen anymore. Then, once he got the bills passed, then he had to set up new government agencies. Those little circles is not an exaggeration. There's over 40 new government agencies that were created, all to help with this crisis. Of course, this is not a revolution, it's merely evolution. Another strange ideology trick sneaking in there. Once you have the agency set up and empowered, then you start issuing new regulations. Thousands of new regulations, and one of the worst groups was the NRA. You had a bunch of government bureaucrats writing regulations about industries they knew nothing about. They wrote a regulation that affected some poor Jewish kosher poultry butchers. They said, according to the government's regulation, they were producing unwholesome chickens, which to them meant unkosher, which means proper, according to the law of Moses. They were convicted. They were convicted on federal felony charges. They were facing years in jail. The standard was, out of all the chickens that they sold, they found 3 that didn't look healthy, and one of them, when it was slaughtered, found out it was egg bound. It actually had formed eggs inside of it. It was a regulation impossible to enforce. Not unless you could stick your head up the chicken's butt with night vision goggles and see the eggs before you slaughtered it. Which is absolutely absurd, because they didn't have night vision goggles in the 1930s. This is the type of regulations that they were writing. Does this sound familiar? Okay. This would later be fought to the Supreme Court, and I'll tell you the outcome later. Then, once all of this is done, you have to spend money. This cartoon is from 1934. It is prophetic, and it speaks volumes. I want to walk you through it. You see that green circle in the very front? The guy whipping the donkey with the cart of the New Deal? It's a man named Tugwell. Tugwell was the head of FDR's brain trust, all these academics that kind of were his circle of close advisors on how to handle this crisis. Tugwell was on that trip to the Soviet Union in 1924. Tugwell came back from the Soviet Union thinking it was a pretty good idea, and he was the head of the brain trust. Right behind him, you see a bunch of guys, academics, obviously whooping it up, getting drunk on a bottle labeled Power. And it has a little thing there, young pinkies from Columbia and Harvard. Trivia question. Name 2 of the 3 universities our current president attended.
Harvard, Columbia.
It's nice to know some things never change. And in the back, you see the FDR's men shoveling money out the back of the wagon as fast as they can and not really caring where it lands, saying, depleting the resources of the soundest government in the world. Down on the corner, that little man there is Trotsky. People that live in this part of the world know that Trotsky went to Mexico for safety because he got into a dispute with Stalin. He was friend of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. Of course, Stalin found him and killed him because he dared to disagree with him. But Trotsky's plan for the United States is to spend under the guise of recovery. Bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, junk the Constitution, and declare a dictatorship. A little side note, it worked in Russia. And our buddy Stalin is over there saying, how red the sun is rising. Does this kind of look like a model of what's happening today? Well, okay, now that he's got this all in the works, how did it work? What do you do next? Well, the next thing you do is you really hope things will change. You see FDR just pouring federal money, priming the pump of the New Deal. Behind him, with the little balloon there saying, I hope this will make it work. Behind him is a poor taxpayer with 7,000 millions more. That's before they invented the word billion. To put it in today's scale, you would have to have 1,000 of those taxpayers carrying the same amount of money to equate what we've spent in the last several years. Of course, like I said, this pump was put together pretty quickly. It had a few leaks in it, just like the IRS misplacing $67 million and not knowing where it went. And if you look, after all of this money and all of the leaks, everything, the little yellow circle shows you what the output of the pump was. Not a whole heck of a lot. And we can't forget the gem, the absolute gem of the New Deal, which was the Social Security Act of 1935. FDR's own actuaries, the bean counters that figure out insurance programs and things like that, his actuaries came to him and said, Social Security will not work. It will put a huge debt on a future generation, which they estimated at that time to be around 1980. But this was prior to the baby boom, which did two things. It pushed that forward, and it also is going to speed up the problems associated with it not working. It distorted the trend line, in other words. Now, the current Labor Secretary feared that the Supreme Court in 1935 might find it unconstitutional. So she had tea with one of the justices, who gave her a bit of advice. Justify it under general welfare and put it under the taxing authority. Where does the general welfare clause appear in the Constitution? In the taxing power. Okay? Her fears were not unfounded, because in 1935, 8 out of the 10 major provisions of the New Deal, including Social Security, were held by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. That thing with the poultry butchers, that's one of the cases that came to the court. The federal government's case was so weak, the Supreme Court threw it out. And after the court proceedings, one of the justices motioned for the White House's attorneys to come into his chambers, and he told them to go back and you tell your boss this stuff ends right now. That's it. This is not going any further. The Supreme Court upheld the traditional meaning of the General Welfare Clause. So what did Roosevelt do? Did he just say, it's the law of the land? Did he just accept it and move on? Oh, no, Delano. FDR's response was to ask for 6 more justices to be appointed to the Supreme Court, because obviously the existing 9 were old and overburdened, and they needed help. The public opinion was against the Supreme Court at the time. They thought that they were being partial to the rich. He used public opinion to bully the Supreme Court. He exerted enormous political pressure on the Supreme Court, which resulted not in what's called the evolution, but the revolution of 1937, also called the switch in time that saved 9. The Supreme Court caved into the pressure. FDR won. The court made a series of decisions upholding the New Deal, abandoned a fundamental constitutional principle, reversed over 150 years of legal precedent, and effectively gave the federal government power it did not and was never intended to have. The collection of Social Security taxes started that same year. But something else happened here. FDR tampered with and successfully distorted or weakened one of the checks on federal power. And what was the effect of all of this? All these government agencies, all these regulations, all this misallocation of money strapped down the economy so that it would not, could not improve. As a matter of fact, unemployment, that black line, never went below the pre-crash levels during the entire New Deal period. The economy went into a double-dip recession, and it was the New Deal that turned a severe recession into the Great Depression. As this young man right here pointed out, it was World War II that got us out of the Depression. Once again, we see FDR now all set out to win the war, and he's telling all his boys, put her out to pasture, put the New Deal out to pasture, and they're singing the old gray mare just ain't what she used to be. World War II got us out of the Depression. That was followed by the Korean War, where we fought the communists. We began to see the post-war realities of the Soviet Union as they scooped up Eastern Europe and started to oppress people. We saw the Chinese Communist Revolution. We saw what a murderous, oppressive, horrendous regime this turned into be. I can understand the guys in the 1920s. But today, I can't, with all that we know about what this is, how we can go along with it is just beyond me. We also had a series of more conservative governments, and all of this helped to keep the impact of the New Deal and the expansion of the federal government somewhat in check for about 30 years. Matter of fact, I actually said the progressive movement collapsed. But they came back with our buddy, our pal, our friend, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was a product of the New Deal. He wanted to outdo Roosevelt and wanted to pass more social legislation than Roosevelt did in his first 100 days in office. His administration ushered in the largest expansion of social programs since FDR, called his Great Society, his War on Poverty, his Urban Renewal. He had the help of a whole new generation who was raised on the myth that the New Deal was a success and that it was constitutional and it was a great thing. But how was how was LBJ going to remake America? A nice little quote right from Johnson's lips. We are going to try to take all that money that we think is unnecessarily being spent and take it from the haves and give it to the have-nots who need it so much. Well, first of all, who are we and who do we think we are? You are not kings. You are not gods. You are not to determine the fates of men. Who do you think you are? We're going to take the money? This is coveting. This is theft. How many violations of the Ten Commandments are there, Pastor? 3 at least that I see. Under his Great Society, he introduced the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the National Endowment for the Arts, giving federal money to art galleries, the Housing Act, the Welfare Act, food stamps, Medicare. He took the provision of the poor into his hands. He took the provision of education into his hands. He took paying teachers with federal money into his hands. I thought we were warned about that. It turns out LBJ's Great Society was not such a great society. It had good intentions with horrendous consequences. The War on Poverty since 1965 has spent $18 trillion. That's $18,000 billion, yet poverty levels are virtually unchanged. Food stamps was originally crafted to address 350,000 people. Today there's 44 million people on it. The original cost was $75 million. Today it is $74,600 million being spent in food stamps, and the USDA is actively spending money recruiting people to come on food stamps. Does that sound like a war on poverty? Welfare destroyed the family structure of millions of minority families, especially African Americans. And it's starting to happen with Hispanics today. In 1965, over 70% of black men were in their homes raising their family. Today, 70% of black children are born out of wedlock. It also destroyed the work ethic. 67% of the people receiving assistance in 1965 were working. Today, it's only 33%. And only 11% are working full-time. Oh, but Glenn, they say, but we have to have our social safety net. There has to be a social safety net. Well, let's look at our social safety net. You take our national debt combined with these general welfare programs, we're $124 trillion in debt. That is 8 times the gross national product of the whole country. But more importantly, it's 50 times the annual revenue of the government. And it's growing. You combine this with health, education, welfare, and Social Security, and it is already today consuming over half the federal budget. And baby boomers are just starting to retire. And I'm not even talking about Obamacare yet. That's not even factored in here. This graphic shows you the amount of money that we're going to have to come up with to pay for these programs. Just for these programs. Does this look safe to you? Oftentimes, nets are made to ensnare, not to catch, and for safety. But then they say, but there's a matter of social justice. Now, they may have good intentions, but these good intentions have turned in my lifetime, have turned the largest lending nation to the largest debtor nation in the world. We have placed an enormous debt on a future generation, something that our founding fathers considered to be highly immoral. Why? Because effectively we have taxed the future generation without them having a voice in it. They have been taxed without representation. They have been sold into economic slavery. Just like the coal miners where I grew up, so too is the future generation. Our posterity are being sold into economic bondage. And millions of people for generations have been locked into unproductive, fruitless lives of dependency, and government agencies are actively promoting this. Does this sound socially just to anybody? What do we say to our posterity? That our intentions were good? Which brings us to today. In spite of all these dismal failures, progressive socialists insist on moving forward with their agenda. Forward, they claim. Today in Congress, there is a Congressional Progressive Caucus. These people are socialists. How can I say that? How can I make such an accusation in public? Well, it was founded by the only openly socialist member of Congress from Vermont in 1991. It has members in there who proclaim on the floor of Congress that they are proud socialists. I'll take them at their word. But I, for the life of me, do not know what they have anything to be proud about. There are over 80 members in this Progressive Caucus that are actively pushing on their agenda through every means that are now available to them, which is not the 18 limited powers of Congress, but now includes education and welfare and the arts and health care and housing and environment and grants and anything else they can get their fingers into to help manipulate and push their agenda. Today, we are at the beginning of a new government health care program which will create over 100 new government agencies writing more regulations in addition to the thousands of regulations already being produced by the EPA and other agencies. This health care program was created for the general welfare. It was upheld by the Supreme Court as a tax. You like baseball? It's like the ever-eloquent Yogi Berra, the New York Yankees, said, it's like deja vu all over again. And I'll conclude by saying simply that it is time for us to see clearly, to let history speak to us. We are witnessing and have witnessed what I've just taken you through, what surmounts to a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evincing a design to reduce us under absolute despotism. What am I quoting?
Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence. What's the next line that says, that comes after that? When this occurs,
When this occurs, we shall throw off the bonds of such.
it is the people's right, it is the people's duty to throw off such government and institute new. Now, I'm not proposing we throw out the entire federal government, most of them, but that's not what I'm suggesting. But it is time that we stand up and insist that certain parts of this get thrown out, stuff that is clearly unconstitutional. These socialist programs, I don't care how good they sound, I don't care how well-intended they may be, what good intentions they may have, any program which is tied to this atheistic ideology has no good root, and it will be an implement of subjugation and slavery. You know, I'll close with one more quote from a man I enjoy very much, Mark Twain, an American humorist. Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Well, if that's true, what we're hearing on the news today is poetry on steroids. Thank you very much.
We're open for questions. Anybody would like to